Good evening. Welcome to everyone watching on Zoom and on Facebook and on Drisha Live. This is the third session of Pruzbol, a Talmud Shiur with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, part of our very packed Fall Zman at Drisha. Rabbanit Sarna, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone. So thanks so much for joining us again. We are picking up today. If you're sitting inside a Gemara Gittin, so we are on Lamed Vav Amud Bet 36b. And if you are in the handout, then we are in source one of the handout, and Kayla's going to put that into the chat. Thank you so much. And if people who are on the Zoom want to show their faces, that's always nice. It'll give me a sense of whether what I'm saying is making sense or not, and whether you have questions and all sorts of fun things like that. I'm also going to open up the chat because just my chat screen, because I know the last couple of times people have been putting really great questions into the chat, and I definitely want to keep encouraging that kind of back and forth because I know it can sometimes be easier than interrupting me. I talk very quickly and without a lot of pauses. So definitely feel free to throw questions into the chat or ideas. I really love that. All right, so we are kind of like a third of the way down the page on Lamed Vav Amud Bet, and we are picking up right where we left off last time. And if you see the Tosfot that starts Ela im Kain Gadol Himanu, we're going to actually be looking at that Tosfot today. So it's like basically right across from that Tosfot and starting after the period. So we're starting with Yubailehu, which is the Gemara has a question. So just so you know where we're going today, and if you have that handout, you'll see it there. So we're gonna look at a whole bunch of Gemara, more Gemara than we've looked at in one go, I think, in any of these classes yet. And then we're gonna look at two different kind of themes that come up in our Gemara. So one is abolishing previous takanot. So that's the question of some really fancy person older than me established some kind of takana, and what if I want to like unestablish it? So specifically, like, could Leah Sarna decide to get rid of Pruzbol even though it was invented by Hillel? That's basically question number one. And then question number two is a different question, but similarly related to our general theme of authority. So question number two is the question of who actually has the authority to issue a Pruzbol. So let's say Kayla owes me money and the Shemitah year is coming. I know usually it's Evie who owes me money, but she's not here, so she can't. So Kayla owes me money and it's the Shemitah year. And so but I don't want to let Kayla off the hook. So who do I need to go to in order to get my Pruzbol? So in the first class, we looked at the Orthodox Union's Pruzbol template. And in that template, it kind of sounded like the same way we do Hatarat Nadarim. I can like go into shul, find three dudes, they can be my beit-din, and they can issue a Pruzbol for me. So that's like option one. And option two is no, I have to go to the beit-din with like the most authority in the world. So I have to go to a beit-din that actually has power to affect something. So maybe that's like only the Rabbanit in Israel, where they have the power to like throw people into prison and stuff like that. Like maybe they're the only beit-din that can actually write me a Pruzbol because they're the only beit-din around that have like real power. So that's kind of option. That's kind of option number two of and that'll be topic number two. So two different explorations of authority for today. And again, welcome people to turn on their videos if they feel like it. Okay, so we're at the Ibailehu. So Ibailehu Gemara has a question. Ki hitkin Hillel Pruzbol. When Hillel established the Pruzbol, lidare hudatakin udilma lidare alma nami takin. So when Hillel established the Pruzbol, did he establish it just for his own generation, or did he establish it for all future generations as well? So the Gemara now asks a question, but I feel like the answer to it to me is like so obvious, but the Gemara asks the question and asks what to me feels like a very obvious answer. Lamai nafka mina, who cares whether Hillel established it just for his generation or for all future generations? What's the difference? And the answer is live chule. The answer is well, if he established it just for his generation, then like, of course we could get rid of it because Hillel didn't establish it to last forever. And so, of course, we could just end it whenever we want because it wasn't made to last forever. Versus if Hillel established it to last forever, then like, whoa, Hillel established it. And but what it gets at is the sense of like, well, what would it mean if Hillel had established it just for his generation and then it kind of like just kept going? So would it mean that in the generations after Hillel, it was still going under the authority of Hillel? Or would it mean that in the generations after Hillel, it was actually being like kept up under the authority of each generation's Beit Din or each generation's rabbi? So that's why the question, I think, is like a little bit more like interesting in texture than when you like first read it, is that it kind of like the answer to the question kind of tells you like, oh, if Hillel had only established it for his generation, then in the next generation, when they're still doing Pruzbol, it's as if it's like being reestablished again in each subsequent generation under like the authority of the rabbis of that generation, which is just a very interesting way to think about takanot in general. But we obviously do have an idea of like takanot that are just for specific circumstances and specific times. So certain practices that like only make sense in times of oppression or things like that, versus practices, which Pruzbol seems like one of them, which are much more about sort of like human nature in general. But then maybe you would say, well, Hillel only established it for a time when people are really not generous. But like, what if in the next generation, there's like a cultural shift and all of a sudden people are super generous? So then you wouldn't need Pruzbol anymore. Because like people would want to give up their loans or something like that. So, or people would want to still make loans even if Shemitah was going to be mishamet the loans. So anyway, so that's what's going on in this question. So the question is, so the answer is the betulei. So the difference between whether Hillel established it for all generations or just for his generation comes down to a difference in how easy it would be to nullify it. Because if you'll say that he established it just for his own generation, then we would just get rid of it. But if you'll say that he established it for all future generations, if he established it for all future generations, then don't we learn in a Mishnah in Ediot, which we're going to see, this is source number 3, that no Beit Din is allowed to, hi Randy, good to see you, no Beit Din is allowed to nullify the words of its fellow Beit Din unless it is greater than it, both in Chokhmah and in Minyan, both in wisdom and in number. Okay, so we're going to do some like looking in to that. We're going to do some looking into that idea of like Chokhmah, Minyan, and what is going on here. Also, like, aren't all Batei Din good? Exactly, Gabriel, great question. What does it mean by Minyan? Aren't all Batei Din the same size? Super important question. Yes, exactly right. Good, we're going to get there. Trying to think if we should keep going or if we should stop here and do question number 1. Okay, let's stop here and do part 1, and then we'll keep going and get to part 2. Okay, so now, if you don't mind, flip to the Mishnah in Ediot where this is all coming from. So we're now in source 3. You can also open up your Mishnayot of Ediot if you want. We're in the first chapter of the Mishnayot of Ediot. So the Mishnah and Ediot, we're kind of coming in the middle here, but the first chapter of Ediot is wondering, well, like, why do you teach minority opinions? Why do we keep minority opinions around at all? V'lama mazkirin et divrei Shammai v'Hillel levatala. So why do we mention minority opinions even though we don't follow them? So then essentially the minority opinion is nullified. Le'lamed ledorot habayim shelo yeha adam omed al devarav. So it's to teach future generations that a person shouldn't always persist in his opinion. He shouldn't always omed al devarav, like stand over his opinions. Sheharei avot ha-olam lo amdu al divreihem, because the fathers of the world didn't stand behind their opinions. And that's not considered insult. Like, I just think that's so important. Nowadays, we're like, oh, you said something and you are not ever allowed to change your mind. If you change your mind, you're a flip-flop and you're inconsistent and you're all kinds of bad things. And the Mishnah says, no, what an amazing thing. We kept the minority opinion, even though ultimately they went with the majority opinion to say, avot ha-olam lo amdu al divreihem. It's just such an amazing, amazing concept. The fathers of the world did not persist in their opinions when they were outnumbered. Okay, v'lama mazkirin divrei yachid bein hamerubim. Okay, so not just Hillel and Shammai, but let's ask more generally now. Why do we mention minority opinions amongst majority opinions? Because we know that the law only ever follows the majority. So the answer is maybe there's a possibility that the Beitin will see the minority opinion and they'll say, oh yeah, that opinion, we like that, let's go with that. For a Beitin is not allowed to nullify the decrees, the words of their fellow Beitin until they're greater than it in wisdom and in number. And somehow, according to this opinion right now, which is a quite complicated one, we're not going to do it full justice. Somehow having the minority opinion like gives you, and that being preserved from a previous time, gives you the possibility that like maybe that was what was decided in their day, but you'll inherit this minority opinion, and maybe you'll find yourself a member of a Beitin that's greater in minyan, which we haven't gotten to yet. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah is going to explain what that is, and greater in chokhmah, greater in wisdom, and greater in number. What does that mean? We don't know yet. And then maybe you'll actually be able to decide like the minority opinion. So then the Mishnah goes on, if it was greater in wisdom but not in number, or greater in number but not in wisdom, if you're missing one of the two requirements, you can't undo a decree until you have both. Great. So Gabriel asks, and again, I mentioned this is like quite complicated, and we're not going to really go into it, but if the new Beitin is greater, why do they need to rely on a minority opinion as opposed to asserting a new opinion? Exactly. So all of these are great questions. I think the easiest way to read it is just that it'll like inspire them. The idea is hanging around, something in that direction. But I think your question really stands, like, well, maybe they could come up with it on their own, or and the other question that you're also asking is like, well, is there some, like, okay, we're a new Beitin, we're greater than the old Beitin, b'chachma u'b'minyan, and we have to choose between their minority opinion or like some new opinion that we had. Is there like reason to take the old minority opinion if we have to choose between them? So that's also, there does seem to be, I guess what I'm seeing in this is a certain amount of like, oh, if it was said in earlier times when they were like, I don't know, closer to Har Sinai, or like had a greater level of connection than we do, there's certain like strength that they carry that's valuable all on its own, and that gives it like another weight. And that's why like you can't just be equal to that Beitin and then overturn their decrees. You have to be better than it, because like if you're equal, well, they're older, so that's always gonna give them the upper hand in certain ways. So there's something about like the older, or like the precedent that has power here. And I think that the minority opinion carries that power of precedent. Okay. But here's Rabbi Yehuda's question. I'm Rabbi Yehuda, exactly your question, exactly our question. Right? Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, but if they can come up with some new, it's exactly Gabriel's question, basically. If they can come up with some new opinion, because now they have the power to change it, then like, okay, but like why mention the previous person? And the answer is, it's like the inspiration answer that I gave before, right? She'im yomar adam kachani mekubal. Because if someone comes along and says, oh, but I heard it like this, they'll say back to him, ish pluni shamata. Oh, they'll say, oh, but that you heard like, and it's great that Rabbi Yehuda is saying this, because so often Rabbi Yehuda is like the named minority opinion in the Mishnah. So it's like really beautiful that he's here, the one saying like, why is it important to name the minority? Here, let me tell you, because if you heard it, oh, I heard it's this way, someone could say, oh yeah, that was, let's say, Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, and we don't go by it, but you can feel like, oh, shkoyach, I had the same opinion as Rabbi Yehuda, which is just great, and it's fun that's coming from him. Okay, Ozzy asks, how can they be greater in wisdom when there is the principle of Yeridat Hadorot? Great. So listen, I think it's definitely possible. Like, I think if we look to the great people of our own time, I think we can say, there was someone in the previous generation who like they're greater than, even though there's Yeridat Hadorot. Like I think the way I understand it is like Yeridat Hadorot is one factor of many. So Yeridat Hadorot plays in when you're equal in Chachma and Minyan, then like Yeridat Hadorot tips the scale towards precedent. But when you actually have more Chachma, and I think it's possible that and again, we don't exactly know like what this Minyan business is yet, what it would mean to have like more Chachma. The Gemara that we're about to look at in Avodah Zarah really gets into it. Yeah, I think it's possible. As well, I guess is where I'm going to say. But let's turn to the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which is source 4. So the Mishnah we're about to see is going to explain it, but we're just like parachuting into a totally different conversation now. But this is one of the main places where the Gemara really deeply fleshes out this idea of like Gadol Himanu b'Chachma Minyan, and that's why we're going there. So fortunately for us, it's talking about something that is very relatable. So the Gemara here is in the middle of a long conversation about different items, food items manufactured by Gentiles and whether they're allowed to be eaten or not. So here we go. Here's the Mishnah. Ve'elu dvarim shel ovdei kochavim asurin ve'ein isuran isur hana'ah. So we have items that belong to Gentiles, which you're not allowed to consume, but you are allowed to derive benefit from them. So example 1 is chalav is milk from Gentiles. Chalav shechalvu v'ei kochavim ve'ein Yisrael ro'ehu. So if a Gentile milked, let's say, a cow, and no Jew was around to watch them, then obviously we know that Rav Moshe at our times thought that this wasn't relevant anymore, and we can have a whole nother conversation about that and why we don't only eat Chalav Yisrael. But this is the origin. This is the Mishnah for Chalav Yisrael. If you are a person who keeps Chalav Yisrael, right? So you're allowed to. You could, for example, own a grocery store and sell non-Chalav Yisrael milk. But if you kept Chalav Yisrael, you wouldn't be able to consume it yourself. So you can get benefit from it, but you can't eat it yourself. And then the other 2 items on the list are hapat v'hashemen shalahem. So bread made by Gentiles and oil made by Gentiles. Now I bet you've never heard of Shemen Yisrael. And the reason for that is Rebbe Ubeit Dino hitiru hashemen. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his court permitted the oil of Gentiles. So we have the Tanakh in the Mishnah says you're not allowed to eat oil made by Gentiles, and then Rabbi Yehuda Nasi comes along and makes a takana. He and his Beit Din make a takana hitiru et hashemen. Fascinating. All right. So now we're going to learn a little bit about the history of the prohibition on Gentile oil. Because what we're interested in is how, like, what is happening in the background here, and how is it possible that Rebbe Ubeit Dino hitiru hashemen when clearly you originally had a takana that it's prohibited. Okay, so that's our question. I hope it's obvious what the relevance is to our Gemara and Gittin. That's why we're here. So now, I didn't bring you all the psukim, but the Gemara brings a pasuk that tries to argue that Daniel in the in the Ketuvim, right, that Daniel this is the one who decreed the prohibition of oil on Gentiles. So how could it be, says the Gemara, Daniel Gazar va'ata Rabbi Yehuda Nasium b'vatalei? How could it be that Daniel made a gzira, made a decree, and that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, so many generations later, is allowed to come around and say, no, actually, the oil is fine. Okay, v'hatnan, that don't we learn in a Mishnah in Ediyot, in Beitin Yachol Batal Divrei Beitin Chaver Ela Yim King Gadol Imanu B'Chachma Minyan. Don't we know that a Beitin isn't allowed to nullify the words of its fellow Beitin unless it's greater than it in Chachma and in wisdom and in number? Okay, and then it goes on like a whole tangent. And then, but before, and as part of that tangent, I suppose, we have this one interesting thing that is important. So the Gemara asks, V'shemen, Daniel Gazar? So is it really true that Daniel is the one who prohibited wine? Va'amar Bailey Avimi Nota'a Mishmei Derav. So Bailey says that Avimi of Nota'a says in the name of Rav, Pitan Ushmanan Yinam Uvnotehem Kulam Mishmonasar Davarhen. So their bread, their oil, their wine, and their daughters intermarriage are all from the 18 matters. So what are the 18 matters? There's this day that's described in a number of places, mostly in the Yerushalmi. We get a great account of it. But there's a day when Beit Shammai outnumbered Beit Hillel, and on that day, 18 matters were decided. And that so he says these are. So how could it be from Daniel? It's from the times of when Beit Shammai outnumbered Beit Hillel, and they made these 18 decrees. So v'chite ma'ata Daniel gazar v'lo kibel v'atu talmidei de Hillel v'Shammai v'gazor v'kibel. So if you want to say that, well, maybe Daniel came along, he made the decree, but it didn't stick, like people didn't accept it. And then later the students of Hillel and Shammai made the decree and they did accept it. So then why do we care, right? Sorry, I cut this out, but Rav is the one who says, yes, like Daniel is the one who made the decree. That happened at the beginning before we started reading. Ella, Daniel Gazar Lav Be'ir, Va'atu Inu V'Gazur Afiu Basadeh. No, it has to be that Daniel made a real gzera. So what is it? Daniel made the gzera in the cities, and the students of Hillel and Shammai made the decree even in the fields. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Hechi Matila Mishra to contact Talmidei Shammai Hillel. Okay, so let's say it's not Daniel whose authority they're undermining, it's the students of Shammai and Hillel. How does he come along? How does Rabbi Yehuda Nasi come along and undo the takana of the students of Shammai and Hillel? Like, it doesn't help you that it's the students of Shammai and Hillel and not Daniel. Like, it's all the same thing. It's still, how does Rabbi Yehuda Nasi have the authority to do that? That's not right. Exactly our same question. Right? Our same question again. How is that even possible? He's still too young. And furthermore, ha-olam Rav Bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan b'kol yachol vatal beitin divrei beitin chaveru chutz mishmonasar davar shafilu yaval yahu beitino in shomim lo. And even more so, to just like push on this even further. So let's say you did have a beitin that was stronger b'chachma of a minyan. Those 18 things, no one, even afilu yavo Eliyahu ubeitino in shomim lo. Even Eliyahu the prophet and his beitin, they're not allowed to undo it. So we have a principle that a beitin can uproot takanot of a previous beitin if they're greater than it in chokhmah minyan, except for these 18 principles. These ones, you're stuck with them until Eliyahu Hanavi comes. And Amar Rav Masharshia comes along and says, why is that? That's very interesting that these 18 really stuck. It's because these prohibitions that were enacted on that day, the prohibitions spread to the majority of Israel. But Shaman lo pashat Yisro berov Yisrael, but the prohibition on oil did not spread to the majority of Israel. The Amar Bishma Bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan because Shmuel bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Yashvu Rabotinu, Badku al Shemen Shalo Pashat Yisrael Barov Yisrael. Our rabbis sat. They did a Pew survey. They checked. They did some demographic research, and they saw that the rules about oil had not spread to the majority of the Jewish people. V'salchu Rabotinu al divrei Rishon ben Gamliel v'al divrei Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok sheomrim in gozring zera al hatzibur elim kain rov tzibur yecholim la'amod ba, and they followed who did we say it was? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, who said you can't make a decree for the community unless the majority of the community is going to be able to keep it up. And then we learn that out from a verse from Malachi, where Malachi says, so you are cursed with the curse, yet you rob me even with this whole nation. So we're not going to get into what exactly they're doing here with Malachi, but ika goy kulo in ilo lo. If you have the whole nation behind you, then you're allowed to make these new takanot, and if you don't have the whole nation behind you, then no new takanot for you. So that's basically. I wanted to bring this because I wanted to bring a few things. So one is that this idea of gadol himenu I'm just realizing that the thing that I thought was in here, I think must actually be in Gittin when we continue it. Okay, anyways. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, so that right, so just to learn out a few things from here. One is Gadol Himenu B'Chachma U'Minyan has a big exception, which is these 18 things that were decreed on that day when Beit Shammai overpowered Beit Hillel. But the reason why that is, and this is the big piece of all of this, is that the community has to accept it. So you shouldn't, on the positive end, the beforehand end, shouldn't make decrees that the community is not going to accept. And this part I think is so fascinating. If there's a decree that was made that the community didn't accept, you can rope it back in. You can unmake the decree, which is just really, really amazing, actually. That you can just say, yep, we tried this thing, it didn't work out. And now maybe even the rules don't, you don't even need to be such a powerful Beit Din as the Beit Din that made it in order to undo it, because it has to be really strong in order for it to stick. Okay. So with that all in mind, let's take a look at the Tosfot. So if you're on the page, we're in Elim King Gadol Himenu. We're not going to do the whole Tosfot. But if you are in the source sheet, then we're source number 6. So go wherever you want to go. So Elim King Gadol Himenu, and we're back now in Gittin, but we're going to do the classic Tosfot thing where he's going to connect Tosfot is going to connect Gittin to the Gemara we just looked at in Avodah Zarah, which is why we just spent so much time in Avodah Zarah, in addition to the fact that it's awesome and fascinating and full of good things. Okay, so Ve'im Tomar. So if you'll say, Hey Chidami ida pashat barov Yisrael, afilu gadol himanu ein yachol levatel. So if you'll say, okay, how is it similar? Because if it had spread to the whole Jewish people, then even Gadol Himanu, even a greater Beit Din, still can't undo it. So meaning if all the Jewish people are doing Pruzbol, then it doesn't matter. You have a greater Beit Din than Hillel, nobody cares. Because you can't undo Pruzbol if everyone is already doing it. So that's Tosfot's question, and he brings that out, which is where we just were, as we said in Avodah Zarah 36a. We said it over there by the 18 things that even if Elijah and his Beit Din come, we still don't listen to them. Lo pashat barov Yisrael. If it hadn't spread to the whole Jewish people, afilu katan yachol levatel, then even a smaller Beit Din could undo it. So how does this even all work? Meaning, if it spread to the whole Jewish people, then even Elijah and his Beit Din can't undo it. And if it hasn't spread, then it kind of seems from the Gemara over there, says Tosfot, that even a smaller Beit Din can nullify it. Kedamrina nami hatam, it says also over there, Gavi Shemed, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiu Beit Dino, Nimnu alav v'hitziruhum, Mishum delo pashadi suro brov Yisrael, as it seems over there, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasiu Beit Dino undid a takana made by Daniel or by Hillel and Shammai, whoever you think made the takana of Shemen, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his Beit Din are not at their level, but still, because it hadn't spread, the practice hadn't spread, it's still, he was still able to do it. And so the Tosfot's question is, just to reiterate the question, like, how does this work? Either, it seems like actually whether the takana spread or not is really the determinant factor. Because if the takana spread, then no matter how fancy of a Beit Din you are, you still can't undo it. And if the takana didn't spread, then you don't have to be a fancy Beit Din. So who cares about Gadol Mimanu Chachma Minyan? Really, it's just Pashat or not Pashat. That's Tosfot's question. Okay. V'yesh lomar, so here's the answer. You could say, Daha kamar hatam misamchur botino al divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel al divrei Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok shayu omrim ein gozrin gzera al tzibor elin kin rob tzibor yochlim la'amud ba. So it said, as we just saw in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, that they relied there on the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok, that you don't make a gzera, you don't make a rule that the community can't. You only make rules that the community can keep. Let's say it on a positive. You only make rules that the community can keep. Mashma mishum dehave tarte. It seems like you have kind of two pieces of how this works. One, hayalahem koach lahatir delo pashat. Oh, there's two options how this works. They had the permission to undo it because it hadn't spread. V'gam lo hayu yecholim la'amod ba. And also because, 1 second, I think I need to sneeze. Sorry, this is awkward. Okay, maybe not. Okay, but now I've lost my place. Okay. Right, so you need like two pieces of it. You have permission to, there's two pieces of it. One is ha-olam koach lahatir, and two is the lo pashat. They had, ha-olam koach lahatir lo pashat, and two is v'gam lo yocholim la'amud. So they were allowed to undo it because it hadn't spread, and also the community hadn't stood for it. So Tosfot's saying it's actually two separate things. The fact that it hadn't spread, maybe in Tosfot's mind, is more about like popularity or something like that. And it's not about the fact that they couldn't keep it. And he's really separating those two things out. So like the instinct would be, yeah, well, what do you think? The fact that it didn't catch on, like, what does that tell you? It tells you, lo hayu yochlim la'amod ba. That, I think, to me, was the really obvious read of the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, that those two things are just like super intimately connected. And Tosfot's really dividing them out into two separate things. You get permission to undo a takana because it didn't spread. And then secondly, they couldn't actually do it. Like the people couldn't do it. Aval hacha, pashat velo hayu yecholim la'amod, hayu yecholim la'amod velo pashat. So here it spread, but they couldn't really like do it right. Or they could do it right, but it didn't really spread. That's like Tosfot's resolution to our problem, right? Because it just seems like it's all about spread. And he's like, no, it really is about two different things. It's about spread and people actually like realistically being able to do it. So then you have the question of like, what does it mean? Are people like realistically like yecholim la'amud ba? It just seems like Pruzbol, when we think of takanot that tell you you're not allowed to do something. Like, for example, don't eat the oil of Gentiles. And here in Gittin, it's like the opposite. It's like Pruzbol is a takana that makes your life easier because all of a sudden you're allowed to actually keep loans. So it's the whole thing that the whole thing that Tosfot's doing here. I think it's like a good read, but it's a little bit tricky because it's just like a very funny, like he like helps us make sense of this question of like, who cares about the like once you have the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, why do you need the Mishnah and Idiot? So he tries to like really make sense of how they could both still matter, and when you would have a situation where Gadol Himenu B'Chochma Minyan would still matter, and he does that with like a very unusual read of the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, and creating situations that are just a little bit confusing and also a little bit hard to relate to Pruzbol. But we are going to see, hopefully in the next 25 minutes, we're going to see that there were definitely places where people were not doing Pruzbol at all. And so maybe that's part of what Tosfot is getting at. I'll just give you like a little bit of a prelude, which is that Tosfot, we're actually not gonna look at this Tosfot. I think that was one of the things that ended up on the cutting room floor from this year, but Tosfot themselves kind of go back and forth about whether like who's allowed to do Pruzbol and whether Pruzbol is a thing that can be done, so much so that it like makes the headlines that one of the Tosfot wrote of Pruzbol. So if you look at if you're on the page, and if you're not, I'm just going to read like 3 words. But if you look on the page to the Alime La'afuke Mamona, and we'll get in momentarily when we turn back to the Gemara and Gittin, we'll get into what those words mean. But like Tosfot has to tell you, Rabbeinu Tam Katav Pruzbol, like Rabbeinu Tam one time made a Pruzbol, and that's actually like a big deal. So on the one hand, we want to say like, oh, Pruzbol is so obvious, everyone knows about Pruzbol, and on the other hand, I think for Tosfot, it's like a big deal. One time when Rabbeinu Tam makes a Pruzbol, and in the Sefer HaYashar, Rabbeinu Tam is like pretty against making Pruzbols, and then he like goes back on his opinion, and maybe I did bring it because maybe the Rush quotes it actually. Anyways, so we'll see that like for us it's like, oh yeah, everyone makes Pruzbol, but for the Rishonim, and particularly the Rishonei Ashkenaz, actually also in Sfarad really, we'll see that Pruzbol is like much less obvious to them, that's the thing that we're still doing. Okay, let's go. We have to see the Rambam before we keep going. But just because the Rambam doesn't really agree with the Tosfot about how this works, like the Rambam just sees it as like much more straightforward. They see it as like requiring all the parts, but it's much more straightforward. So here's how the Rambam ties it all together. We're in source number 7. Beitin shegazru gzera o tiknu takana v'inhigu minhag ubashada davar b'kol Yisrael. So Beitin make a gzera, and they make a decree, enact an ordinance, and everyone. Or they introduce a custom, and it spreads to all of Israel. Va'amad acharehem beitin acher, and in the next generation, or after them, comes along the next beitin. V'ikesh lebatal dvarim harishonim u'akerota hatakana ba'ota hagzira ba'ota minhag. So the next beitin comes along, and they want to nullify the actions of the first beitin. They want to uproot the decree or the ordinance or the custom. Ino yachol, they're not allowed to. Ad sheyeh gadol min harishonim b'chachma u'minyan. They're not allowed to do that until they are greater than the original ones in chachma and minyan. So again, remember Tosfot had said we're separating out either the spread or people not being able to do it. And Rambam doesn't have any of that. He says, no, the situation is they made a takana and it spread throughout all of Israel. That's like the foundational thing. And in that situation, that's when you need a beitin who's gadol mimenu v'chachma u'minyan. Okay. And then the Rambam says, Haya gadol b'chochma, they're greater in wisdom, of alo b'minyan, b'minyan of alo b'chochma, eno yachol levatel et dvarav. If you have chachma but not minyan, minyan but not chochma, then you can't nullify their words. Afilu batel hatam should be galo gazru harishonim oekidu ein achronim yachlim levatel ad sheyihu gdolim mehem. Even if the reason for the original Gzera has disappeared, you still aren't allowed to get rid of it until you are greater than the original beitin. Oh, here. Ozzy, this is for you. We have a co-beitin, how is it possible for them to be greater in minyan, since every single beitin is 71 people? So he says, how is it possible? Every Beit Din is 71. So how is it possible for a Beit Din to be greater in minyan? And they say it's actually about the number minyan chochmei hador. So it's about the number of wise people in that generation. So like, okay, you're 71, we're 71, but how many of your 71 are really Talmidei Chachamim? Because in my 71, there were more Talmidei Chachamim than in yours. So it's actually interesting. Like the Rambam is really combining Chachma and Minyan into one. And obviously you could find situations where it's different, right? Like your Beit Din has 70 mediocre people, but one person who has more Chachma than like anyone ever again. Whereas the next generation has like maybe like 15 really, really smart people who have combined all more chachma than that like one guy did before. So then they are greater b'chachma minyan because they have like both more wisdom and more wise people, which I suppose are in fact separable categories, as we just demonstrated. And therefore, they would be greater b'chachma minyan than the first. In the first Beit Din, and could undo their gzirot, says the Rambam. And then he says, okay, but only certain things you're allowed to undo and certain things you're not allowed to undo. I think we're going to leave that, but you can keep reading the Rambam on your own. Always a good use of time. Okay. Right, and he describes like what happens if the Beit Din made a rule that applies only for their time. Are you allowed to undo it? Things like that. But I think we got to keep going because I have a whole nother section here that I want us to at least look at, and we definitely have to finish the Gemara without question. So here we go in the Gemara. We're back in. So just to like wrap that up a little bit. So we saw a debate between the Tosfot and the Rambam about how to deal with this question that the Tosfot raises, which is a pretty good question of like, who cares about Gadol Minyan v'Chachma Minyan? Doesn't it just seem like, based on the Gemara and Avodah Zarah, it's really just all about acceptance or not acceptance, or like spread and not spread. And then he separates out acceptance from like capability to stand by it. And that's how Tosfot resolves it. So you can have one but not the other. And then in a case where you have one but not the other, the Beit Din needs to be Gadol Minyan v'Chachma Minyan. And the Rambam says, like, no, I don't see this problem at all. And actually, the whole situation only arises when you had spread. And if you didn't have spread, then you don't need a Beit Din Gadol Minyan v'Chachma Minyan. All right, that's the Rambam. Okay, so we are now in the Tashma. Oh no, we are not. Sorry, we're earlier than that. Okay, so right? That's what we're up to. Okay, so if people see, I don't know how to describe it to you, but I'll tell you if you're going back onto the pages where we are. So if you're in the handout, we are on the first page and we are here at this my. So in the English, it's going to say something like, what then is the halacha? That's what it says in English. Okay, my. So Tashma, the Amar Shmuel, lo katvin on Pruzbol, ella iva beidina de surah, iva beidina de naharda. So what's the halacha? Meaning, did Hillel make a Pruzbol institute Pruzbol for all time, or did he only institute it for his own generations? So Shmuel maybe wants to say, oh, he only did it for his own time, and how I know this is that nowadays we only write Pruzbols in places where you have Batei Din that have a lot of authority, like Surah and Naharda. And if you think that Hillel established it forever, then they should write Pruzbols in every Beit Din, because they're all doing it on the authority of Hillel. They shouldn't need, says Shmuel, a Beit Din shouldn't need its own authority in order to write a Pruzbol, because every Beit Din writing a Pruzbol is just doing what Shmuel told them to do. Is doing what Hillel told them to do, says Shmuel. The fact that we only do it in fancy Batei Din means that each generation is writing Pruzbols on their own authority and are using like the highest authority of the time in order to write Pruzbols, says Shmuel. Dilma, ki takin Hillel adari alma, But you could really say, no, Hillel did establish Pruzbol forever. Kegon Beidina Didai, but he established that Pruzbol should only be written in Bate Din like his own. Rav Ami v'Rav Asi, and like the Bate Din of Rav Ami and Rav Asi, the Alime la'afkue mamona, that they were so strong that they could actually confiscate money from people, right? So if we said, and that's a very consistent opinion, if you hold by what we were talking about last week, and you hold by Rava, who says that the whole mechanism of Pruzbol is hefker beit din hefker. Even when it was established by Hillel, the mechanism was hefker beit din hefker. Then you need a beit din that is strong enough to actually be really mafki or something that could actually like take something away from someone. Okay, so you need a beit din that is alime, they're strong enough, la fuke mamuna, to take out money from somebody. But a normal beit din is not allowed to do that. Okay, so that's kind of our next line of inquiry. But I do wanna keep going here a little bit before we get there. So Tashma, we have another. The Gemara says, "Come in here." The Amar Shmuel. Shmuel said, and remember, Shmuel so far seems to be. Well, all we really know about Shmuel is that he says only fancy Bate Din can write Pruzbols, but the Gemara used Shmuel's opinion to try and argue that therefore Pruzbol was only established like for Hillel's generation. Okay, and Shmuel seems to like not like Pruzbol so much because he says, "Ha Pruzbola ulbana dedayanihu." Pruzbol is an ulbana. We're gonna get there in a second. What is an ulbana? The Gemara is gonna ask. Right, so sorry, Gabriel, I just saw your question, but I'll circle back to it at the end. So Shmuel says this Pruzbol is a humiliation. Well, but now we're gonna go with humiliation for now, but we'll temper that translation later. Maybe it's a humiliation of the judges. If my strength were straight, like it's the same kind of idea as Yasher Koach. Like if my strength were optimal, I would nullify it. Avtalina, you would nullify it. How could you nullify it? You're not allowed to nullify it. It was made by Hillel. Hachi Kamar, like this, he says, you tear me Hillel. If I could pull together a beit din that would be gadol mimenu v'chachma minyan of the beit din of Hillel, if I had that beit din would get rid of Pruzbol, says Shmuel. Fighting words, Shmuel hates Pruzbol, which I think is just really great. This question of like, we started out with this question of like, isn't Shmuel and isn't Pruzbol an Isser Torah? And then our next question on Pruzbol was like, okay, if it's not an Isser Torah, then isn't it theft? So like it seems like that the Gemara is heavily influenced by this position of Shmuel, who's like, yeah, if I could get rid of Pruzbol, I would get rid of Pruzbol. It seems like the stam of the Gemara is really on Team Shmuel here. But Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman Amar Akaimenu. No, I would keep Pruzbol. The Gemara says, Akaimenu? What do you mean you would keep Pruzbol? It's kept, it's standing, it's alive and well. Pruzbol. No, this is what it means. I would say about Pruzbol, if I had a beit din as strong as Hillel's, what I would say about Pruzbol is that we shouldn't even be having this conversation because I would make it as if Pruzbol were written in the Torah, says Rav Nachman. So the opposite, right? Shmuel says I would totally get rid of it, and Rav Nachman says I would keep it and I would strengthen it to the furthest possible degree, says Rav Nachman. Okay, so now we're gonna get to this nice question of Yubalahu. Question. Hi Ubana, this Ubana that we translated before as humiliation. Lishna de chutzpah, is it language of chutzpah, like rude, irreverent, like awkward, I don't know, uncomfortable? Oh, lishna de nichutahi, or is it like pleasant language? So Rashi says lishna de nichuta is lo asauhu ela lenachar hadayanim shelo yatrichum lahagbot Malvotayam lifnei shvit shelo tavo shvit v'tashmitea hilkach asher chel of talinhu. So is it that Pruzbol was invented just to like be comfortable for the judges and make it so that they don't have to like go actually do the work of going to collect all of their money before the Shemitah starts in, and it just like allows people to kind of like be lazy, and therefore like you should get rid of Pruzbol, right? So Lishna Denichuta is I mean, either way, it's right. It's a quote within Shmuel. So you want, even within Lishna Denichuta, it still has to make sense for Shmuel to say whatever Ulbana means. That's a reason why he wants to get rid of it. So whether it's Pruzbol is rude or Pruzbol is too comfortable, either way, Shmuel's resolution is I would want to get rid of it. Okay, so Tashma, come and listen to Amar Ula. Ula says, Aluva kalashet zintab kerev chupata. It is chatzufa. It is rude, says Rashi, like a bride that cheated while still under her chuppah. Like that's how inappropriate Ula thinks Shmuel thinks Pruzbol is. That by doing Pruzbol, we're cheating under the chuppah. Which is like a really strong language to give to Shmuel about Pruzbol. Amar of Mary Bara de Bat Shmuel. So Rav Mary, who is the son of Shmuel's daughter. So he is saying, what did my grandfather mean by this, right? Rav Mary Bara de Bat Shmuel. My kra, what does the pasuk say? Ad shehamelech b'msibo nirdina tanrecho. While the king is still in his party, my nerd, which is a like scenty thing, but like not a good one. It gave off its scent. So Rava says, Adayin chavivuta hu gaban dechtiv natan v'lo ketiv hisriach. So Rava says, no, he still liked it. Rava says, actually, right, and this is Rava seems to be on Team Pruzbol. Rava is the one who before gave really like the best interpretation of how Pruzbol could work and kind of resolved all the problems with this idea of Hefker Beitz and Hefker. He says, yeah, but even though it's like a little bit cheating, it's still chavivuta, it's still beloved. Dechtiv natan v'lo ketiv hisriach, because it's given, not right, nerdi natan recho versus nerdi hisriach recho, that it's still the chatan still likes, or the melech in this case still likes receiving it, and doesn't just call it like rancid or disgusting. And then we end with a final breita on this matter. Tnu Rabbanan, hana elavin ve'inan olvin shom'in charpatan ve'in mashivin usim me'ahava smichu bisurin. So we have a final breita: those who are humiliated but don't like fight back, don't humiliate back, who hear their own disgrace and don't do anything about it. They act from love and they're happy in their suffering. Upon them, the verse says, "Vo'avav kitzida shemesh b'gvurato," which is from Shoftim. So it's a little bit interesting, and if we had more time, I definitely want to hear what you think is happening with this. Why we're seeing this breita here, other than, well, maybe we went down an Ulbana, we went down an Ulbana rabbit hole, and so now we're just saying, oh, we have this nice breita about Hana Elavim. Or you could say, like, it's actually this whole big theological question of like, is God offended by Pruzbol? And then if that's the question, then like, how is this as an answer is really phenomenal. That like, yes, God is offended, but doesn't strike back. That actually, like, yes, Pruzbol is in some ways an offense to God and an undermining of like what Shemitah is truly all about. But at the end of the day, like God is Ne'ela ve'inan uliv, or something like that, which is a truly incredible possibility of what the Gemara here is doing. Right, Tracy says, Lo b'shamayim, right? It's not in the heavens, and people are allowed to make, especially really important big batei din, who, when they make decrees, the decrees are accepted, are allowed to make really, really Torah bending decrees. So I want to spend the next 5 minutes. We're not obviously certainly not going to look at all of these sources I have compiled for you. But I do just want to point out that there's a big debate about what kind of Beit Din can make a Pruzbol. So the Rambam says, who can make a Pruzbol? Chachamim gedolim beyoter kebeit dino shel Rabbi Ami v'Rabbi Asi shehen re'uim lafkia mamon b'nei adam. In Kufin, right? So the Rambam is essentially saying anywhere where a Beit Din doesn't have the power to take people's money away from them, doesn't have the power to write a Pruzbol. And that is a very good read of the Gemara, but a very hard read in terms of having Pruzbol continue to exist, because you really need to be in a place where Batei Din have power in order for them to be able to write. Pruzbols. We're going to skip the rush and go to his son, the Tur, who is source number 10. And the Tur says, the Torah says we write them even in this time in every Beit Din. The late Hilchata Kishmuel says the Torah. The halacha is not like Shmuel, who says, right, the Amar in Kodvino El the Beit Dina the Surah of the Naharda. Ella b'chol Beit Din u'Beit Din yachol lakatvo. Says the Torah. No, every single Beit Din is allowed to write a Pruzbol, says the Tur. And then I just wanted you to see, we can just skip to this bolded part of the mi-penei. So far we've seen the Mishnah Torah saying you have to be a crazy strong, actually we should really look at the Ran, I think. So right, the Rambam says you have to be a crazy strong Beit Din in order to write a Pruzbol, and the Tur says, any Beit Din can write a Pruzbol. And the Ran says, let's see if I can find where he says it quickly. Yeah, here, just the last line. Shmamina afilu beidina delo nafi shchila matil mechtav deledare alma takin. Right, he really spells it out. He says, a powerful Beit Din in its own time, but it doesn't have to be so powerful. It doesn't have to be as powerful as the Rambam says it needs to be. That kind of Beit Din, it's okay. They can still write a Pruzbol because Hillel established Pruzbol forever, and therefore, like any Beit Din nowadays can write a Pruzbol because you're just working off of Hillel's power. But here's the and then the mi-penei says, if we were to write a Pruzbol, then right, okay, here we're starting from, you see the bolded part that I bolded, that's just me bolding it, so we're starting like 2 lines above that. In other words, a Pruzbol can't be made by any Beit Din that comes along. Rather, it needs to be made by a Beit Din that is important, they're expert. So it can't be, any Beit Din, I walked in the shul, grabbed 3 guys, made them my Beit Din, boom, we made a Pruzbol. No, it needs to be a Beit Din that's sitting in the city. When that Beit Din says things, people do it, people go to them with their problems. That's the type of Beit Din, says the mi-penei, that can make a Pruzbol. But but now in our times, in places where they still do Shemitah Ksafim, right, we haven't even talked about this, that in the times of the Rishonim, there were people who said like Shemitah doesn't apply anymore, and some people who said Shemitah does apply anymore. Anyway, it's a whole big argument. But he says in places where they do Shemitah Ksafim, but because our Batei Din aren't stable and they're not important enough, we don't get wrapped up in all these rules about Pruzbol. We don't do them anymore. And if you don't want the Shemitah year to come and release all your loans, So you should make a loan on the condition that it doesn't go away with Shvi. So that's his like alternate Pruzbol, that when Kayla takes out on a $1 million loan from me, I say, Kayla, I'm giving you this loan on the condition that Shemitah doesn't apply to it. And somehow that works. Like you normally can't be, you can't like make conditions that violate the Torah. That's a whole big topic for another time. But here it says in the Iri, that's how you would do it today, because he doesn't want there to be, he thinks like we don't have anyone powerful enough to make Pruzbol, and we'll just round it out with the Shulchan Aruch at exactly 9 o'clock. Pruzbol ino mishamit ve'ino nechtav el veitin chashuv dahainu shlosha bekiyin bedin ve'inyan Pruzbol ve'yodim inyan shmita. And people really trust them in that city, and right, so it has to be written by a Beit Din that's really important, and they really know the law, and they know about Pruzbol, and they know about Shemitah, and everyone in the city really believes them. But yesh omrim dekotvim Pruzbol b'kol Beit Din v'nir ali deyesh lahakal bezman hazeh. So he says there's three different or two opinions, and he says you should go by the more lenient one. Says the Shulchan Aruch that any Beit Din today can write a Pruzbol. So he, of our variety of different opinions, he seems to be following in the direction of the Tur, which is interesting because often the Shulchan Aruch really likes to go in the direction of the Rambam, and here he doesn't. So whenever the Shulchan Aruch passes against the Rambam, that's kind of interesting. All right, we have a number of questions. Ozzy says, is the debate whether or not you can create legal fictions? What's the legal fiction for you here? Is the legal fiction the Pruzbol, like the existence of a Pruzbol is legal fiction? Yes. So I think that, I don't know, I would push back on the idea that Pruzbol is a legal fiction. Like Pruzbol, if it works the way we discussed last week, it works by Hefker Beit Din Hefker. That's like, I don't know, that's like pretty exciting. That's like pretty compelling that it's not like that, it actually works. Maybe you'd say it's a loophole, or it gets you out of a din Torah. Like that all feels very like, yeah, like I get that question. That's clearly where the Gemara is going with this. But I don't know that I would call it a legal fiction. And Gabriel says Pruzbol without a Beit Din. Yeah, right. So what the Meiri is suggesting is a Pruzbol without a Beit Din, but that's a really weird thing to do, and to make conditions that uproot like Torah law is a very problematic thing to do in general. All right, we will be back here next Monday night with more about Pruzbol, since if we're keeping them, then we should know more about how they work. So we're going to be talking about whether in order to make a Pruzbol, you need property. That's going to be our next topic. In Kudvin Pruzbol Ella al Hakarka. And we're going to tie it in also to other sales that you might be familiar with, like Mechirat Chametz.
All right. Thank you, Rabbanit Leah. That sounds very exciting. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today on Zoom, on Risha Live, and on Facebook. We're going to continue with our Falzman programming tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern with a session from Rabbi Silber on the topic of prayer in the prayer book, the Siddur as a guide to prayerful reflection. There's also a new class starting up this week on Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time called Shemitah, Radical Perspectives on Society, Land, and the Individual, more on Shemitah, with Rabbanit Gila Rosen. And you can find more information about upcoming fall programming on our website at drisha.org/classes. Thank you again, Rabbanit Sarna, and thank you for everyone who came and learned tonight. And I hope to see you again soon.